I must say I was a bit surprised at Anubis's response, just based on how many things he said that were matter-of-factly not true. I'm just thinking that, if I was in his positions, I would have, done cursory Google searches on these things before coming out and saying them, because these are things that can be easily verified or falsified with the appropriate search terms. But it appears Anubis did not do that, though I probably should not be surprised about that at this point. Let's start off with test bias. Anubis asserted that IQ tests are biased in favor of whites, and when blacks are given sentence questions that are more familiar to their culture, they do better. And this is famously not true. Arthur Jensen's book, Bias in Mental Testing, showed that blacks not only do better relative to whites on verbal tests than nonverbal ones, but they also do better on culture-loaded tests than they do on these carefully screened, quote-unquote, culture-fair tests. The test bias theory is just an often repeated hypothesis that was simply and conclusively shown wrong. Now, let's talk about twins and IQ heritability. I brought up a study in a video a while ago of identical twins reared apart, and Anubis pointed out that those twins shared the same womb environment, so the similarity between them could be epigenetic. Okay, well, when we look at non-identical twins, or fraternal twins, reared together and non-identical twins reared apart, we see that non-identical twins have a much lower correlation in IQs than identical twins, which is evidence that epigenetics is not a driving force. Now, of course, the fraternal twins have a higher IQ correlation than siblings, both reared together and reared apart, and that seems to be where epigenetics comes in. Or it could be an environmental effect that has nothing to do with epigenetics. For example, if a mother has fraternal twins and puts them up for adoption at the same time, we would expect slightly more similarity in adoptive environment than if a mother had two kids that were placed in a different adoptive environment at different times in the mother's life. So even if they are adopted or put up for adoption, we can expect more similarity in environment in twins, because they're born at the same time, than in siblings that are born at different times. And this same thing can be said for being reared together. Right? Birth order may have an impact on the environment that siblings face, resulting in an IQ difference that has nothing to do with epigenetics. Right? Now, this is just a theory on my part, right? As is the theory that epigenetics is causing the higher correlation of IQs between fraternal twins than normal siblings. The point of saying this stuff is that epigenetics is not necessary to explain observed phenomenon. And the thing about epigenetics, which is a concept that I'm hearing thrown around a lot, is that it's extremely difficult to falsify. For example, let's say someone says that blacks score lower on some test or whatever because of epigenetic effects that trace back to slavery. How can this be falsified? But thinking within the box of epigenetics, blacks and Hispanics appear to be less stressed today than whites, which I'll link to in the description. And this dovetails with the notion that the rich are more stressed than the poor, right? Because white people are richer than blacks and Hispanics, and white people are more stressed than blacks and Hispanics. Now, maybe what you could show is that a given Hispanic person, as he becomes wealthier, he becomes less stressed. And that a given black person, as he becomes wealthier, he becomes less stressed. And a given white person, as he becomes wealthier, he becomes less stressed. And so that this dynamic could be true for all races, but it's just that whites are simply more stressed for any given income level. Now, as stated before, you obviously couldn't just show that poor people are more stressed than rich people, as that would present a correlation-causation problem. Now, maybe blacks and Hispanics were more stressed than whites in the past, and those effects are the main cause of the current inequalities, but again, there's no way to really falsify that. But another point Anubis made was about Jews. And though he didn't say Ashkenazi or Semitic, just Jews, which is important because the Jews with the high IQs that everyone talks about are Ashkenazis. Semitic Jews are about the same as Arabs. Anyway, his point was that in the 1900s, IQ tests showed that Jews, and I'm assuming, they came from Europe. He's talking about Ashkenazi Jews. He showed that they had lower IQs than whites in the 1900s. And I don't deny that IQ tests have been used improperly, nor do I deny the effects of environment, especially when a population is malnourished, probably sleep deprived, and highly stressed at the time of taking the test, right? If you're fleeing a bad environment wherever you came from, you're crammed onto a boat and you're sailing all the way over to America, then you land at Ellis Island and some guy says, all right, here, take this test. You're not going to do very well. Okay? And I don't know anything about these tests he's talking about, but I'm assuming that it was something like that. Right? And I think that because Ashkenazi Jews today, as we all know, have the highest IQ of any race. And it's really funny that he should bring up this stuff about Ashkenazi Jews, since they face quite terrific persecution in Europe, and yet manage to have the highest IQ of any race, which at least suggests that epigenetics are not a driving force in group differences. Now, just imagine if today Jews had lower IQs. What would they be saying? They would be saying, oh, it's because of persecution and epigenetics that their IQ is lower. Right? But since it's higher, it's ignored. See? Similarly, the ethnic Chinese in Malaysia face legal and cultural discrimination and have been for quite some time, yet they remain a market-dominant minority, and their average IQ is about the same as that of ethnic Chinese in Taiwan. Now imagine if Chinese in Malaysia had lower IQs, and Malays had higher IQs than the Chinese in Malaysia. People would be saying, oh, well, clearly it's because of persecution and epigenetics that these Chinese have lower IQs, right? Or similarly, the ethnic Armenians in Turkey face legal and cultural discrimination and have been for quite some time, yet they are a market-dominant minority and their average IQs are higher than that of the Turks, and I believe are about the same as of ethnic Armenians in Armenia. Now imagine if Armenians in Turkey had lower IQs. What would people be saying? They'd be saying, oh, it's because of persecution and epigenetics. Half Sigma had an excellent quote that sums up my view on epigenetics being applied to race and IQ. Quote, "This is a debating tactic that the left-wing human biodiversity deniers stole from the creationists who take every single thing about evolution that's not 100% certain and say, aha, that proves that evolution was wrong and that God created us. Left-wing human biodiversity deniers seem to be saying that because we don't know every single thing there is to possibly know about genetics, this proves that the races are exactly equal in intelligence. This is ridiculous. This type of argument was used by the Catholic Church against Galileo, and in fact, Galileo was wrong about a whole lot of crap. He thought the planetary orbits were perfect circles, and he was completely wrong about comets. But Galileo is not remembered for what he got wrong. He's remembered for being correct in his main argument, which is that the Earth and other planets revolve around the sun. Then Anubis pushed the stereotype threat line, showing that children with blue eyes who are told that blue eyes means you're stupid performed worse. Children with brown eyes, who are told that people with brown eyes are stupid perform worse. Everyone's heard about that study. And he also referenced the infamous Claude Steele study, right? Stereotype threat and the intellectual test performance of African Americans. Now in this, Claude Steele found that black and white college students, when controlled for SAT scores, scored about the same on an IQ test when they were told nothing, and blacks did worse when the test administrators brought up race and IQ before administering the test. So what this suggests is that if stereotype threat is present, it will negatively affect the IQ of the group facing it. And I say suggests because I have a lot of problems with this. But first, keep in mind that blacks have higher self-esteem than whites, according to a survey of 140 studies by Sandra Graham of UCLA and a survey of 261 studies by David Williamson and other psychologists at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And also greater self-esteem in terms of academic ability. So what these stereotype threats studies show is that little kids can be made to perform poorly if they are told that they are stupid. But it doesn't show that college students can be made to perform poorly from it, because we don't know if those black students really were shocked by that race and intelligence stuff, or if they were just trying to give the results that would be politically efficacious. It's well known that in marketing, when people are asked questions by a marketer, people will tend to give answers that they think the marketer wants to hear. right? People tend to be compliant if it doesn't cost them anything, right? And the reason I say this may be the case here is because, you know, these college students had an average SAT of about 1100, okay? And they knew how averages worked. They knew that black people scored lower on average, right? Every black person eventually figures this out, yet they managed to get into that college. And they just happened to score lower on a test when a black score would be used as evidence for this stereotype threat on a test that they would not be hurt by scoring lower on, right? They didn't score lower, you know, on, well, like for example, if they score low on the SAT, that's going to cause them some problems. But if they score lower on this little test that Claude Steele gave them, it didn't cause them any problems, right? So this is the expectancy bias. Also, there was a presentation where a guy showed evidence for publication bias in stereotype threat, and I'll link to it, and it has the name of the guy. I forgot the name of the guy right now, and I didn't write it down here. But there's a presentation where a guy showed evidence of publication bias in stereotype threat. That is, studies which showed stereotype threat having a negative effect, those studies get published, while studies which show that stereotype threat creates a positive effect or no effect don't get published, right? You know, and we've all like seen this, right? You tell someone that they're stupid and they try to prove you wrong. That kind of like Anubis is doing right here, you know, with the title of his videos. But unfortunately, the site that linked to the presentation took it down, and all I have a link to is an abstract. However, these findings were quoted by Wikipedia and VDare, so it's not just me saying, well, there was a guy who said this. Like, Wikipedia is confirming that this presentation did in fact take place. Then Anubis conflates stereotype threat with learned helplessness. He cites an example of illiterate black teens learning Chinese after having been unable to learn English, and the idea is that this is because of bad memories from learning English, creating a mental block that didn't exist when learning Chinese. But this is not evidence of stereotype threat, as obviously the majority of black people can read and write English. Learned helplessness and stereotype threat are separate issues. One is saying that you can't do this because you are black. The other is saying that you can't do this because you haven't been able to do this for a long time. They're not the same thing. Another point Anubis made was claiming that parents passing on a cognitive trait like ambition to their children is an example of me not knowing how genetics and neurology works. Now, since he brought up neurology here, maybe his point was that heritability doesn't apply to the brain in the same way it applies to something like muscle mass, which is usually just some intermediate result between the traits of the parents. Or maybe his argument is that an intermediate arrangement of neural clusters causes behavioral patterns that aren't intermediate. Kind of understand what I'm saying there? I don't know, because he didn't explain anything. He then says it takes thousands of years of evolution for a positive trait to be expressed in a person, but that a negative trait can be expressed easily. Now, I heard Anubis is a biologist or a biology major or something, and I'm not. But this statement appears to be clearly wrong in two ways. First, you and I have a lot of traits, right? Different people have different traits. It didn't take thousands of years of evolution for different people to get different traits from their parents. It took one generation, two people had sex, combined their genetic material, and passed on the traits in the very complex ways in which genes are expressed. Now, one could say that, of course, behind that generation is thousands of years of evolution. Nobody is denying that, but that's not what I'm talking about. Now, I don't know if Anubis misunderstood what I was saying or what, because he then goes on to say that what we call ambition is really just sociopathy, okay, and I have no opinion on that. But, and then, so just replace ambition with sociopathy, but then Anubis seems to be saying that sociopathy is passed on in a single generation, which is what I was saying about ambition. So I'm correct. Thanks, Anubis. And people with sociopathic genes, or epigenetic expressions of sociopathy or whatever, pass on in a single generation. Second off, what is a positive trait and what is a negative trait is a matter of opinion. So to say that it takes longer for a positive trait to be expressed than for a negative one, this statement is just non-cognitive. And again, I know you're the biologist, but this seems really, really wrong to me. Okay, then he laid a big whopper about teaching kids vocabulary, raising IQ. Now, as it turns out, early intervention studies have shown this not to be true, at least not for very long. There are some IQ gains from early intervention, and this is extreme early intervention, right? Starting at 6 weeks and 12 weeks, okay? This is not preschool stuff, okay? And even this level of intervention doesn't last, right? They're like babies, basically, being trained by professionals, right? Using every trick in the book they can to raise their IQ. And even in this ultra-interventionist environment, the gains don't last. And right, the theory as to why this is that while you can teach someone a lot of words, for example, their functional vocabulary won't expand unless they are routinely thinking in concepts that use those words. And early on, the words you teach a kid, he'll use them all, and his or her brain will grow to incorporate all those words. Like you'll think in terms of shoes and clothes, right? And so if you teach someone clothes early on, eventually their brain will grow that they will start to incorporate and use that concept a lot. But if you teach them things like, vernacular or more complex words that relate to more complex concepts, if they're not regularly using those complex concepts, their functional vocabulary is not going to improve, right? And so even if you teach them a lot of these words, that doesn't mean that they will then be able to use those words as a stepping stone to further progress later on. It's just that they get to their endpoint quicker. That's what has happened, right? However, early intervention, while not being able to raise IQ, has been able to increase academic performance and lead to various positive social outcomes, which is really the point, is it not? But, being the wet blanket that I am, I'd like to point out that in the Abecedarian Project, which was the model early intervention that everyone points to, and this is the one where they're taking kids at, 6 weeks, babies at 6 weeks, in this project, the parental IQ was actually a stronger predictor of academic performance and positive social outcomes generally than being involved in the program. All right? So even though involvement in the program had positive effects independent of parental IQ was still a more powerful predictor than the intervention, the most extreme intervention that was known at the time. All right? And I focus on the Abecedarian Project because that's the one with the best results. Head Start is known to fade out really bad, and the Perry Preschool Project also failed any lasting results. The Abecedarian Project had some superior social outcomes, not even gains in IQ. Okay, he then had a picture of a political cartoon with a bunch of white students who got in to a college because of something special about them not having to do with academics, for example, a soccer player, a donation, and a legacy. And there was a black student who got in, obviously, for affirmative action. At least that's what the cartoon was implicating. And then there's a white student who didn't get in, blaming the black student for not getting in and not the other white students. Well, first off, the other white students had something unique about them. For example, being from another country, for example, provides real diversity. Right? Someone from Eastern Europe provides real diversity. A black person, quite frankly, does not provide a unique perspective at all. Also, legacy preferences are actually lower than racial preferences. The bonus you get from being a legacy is actually lower than the bonus you get from racial preferences. But the thing is, legacy students have an average SAT 20 points higher than that of non-legacies. Okay, so even though there is legacy preference, as it turns out, legacies actually have higher SATs going into college than non-legacies. Which, even if there is discrimination in their favor, it's not having any impact, is what I'm saying. Okay, then Anubis went off the rail talking about racism, and I really don't have the energy for any of this crap. Unbelievably, he actually linked to Tool Time's deranged auto-racist tirade. But given how awful Anubis' arguments have been up to this point, one really shouldn't be surprised. Now, I'll link to Laughing Man's excellent response to Tool Time. And I've been civil so far, but at this point I just have to say it. Anubis, you are indeed a moron. Now just some miscellany, I don't know how to pronounce that. I know that I use the term blacks and whites, even though those are colors and not racial categories, but people know what I mean when I say blacks and whites. And also, I'm not going to call black people African Americans because I know more about Africa than most black people. Okay. And this isn't something Anubis brought up, but I know that some of you will bring this up, and that's the idea that IQ doesn't matter. IQ just measures what you can score on an IQ test. And I'll link to a post that shows that IQ does matter. As bad as Anubis' reasoning is, he at least appears to understand that, yes, IQ does measure something meaningful, and people with higher IQs, ceteris paribus, have better results in life. And lastly, I just want to justify why I talk about race and IQ as much as I do, even though I don't really talk about it that much. In fact, it's been responding to Anubis that I've actually been talking about the most. But the issue has to do with equality being used as a political weapon. Because if we assume that all racial groups are of equal innate intelligence, then this means that outcome differences between the groups is a result not of anything innate, but is caused by environment or discrimination, right? Or something nefarious. And this line of reasoning is then used to justify greater taxation and institutional racial discrimination against whites. Right? The assumption of equality between groups has profoundly negative political consequences.